This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 24 of season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, June 17th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. A good July 4th celebration is in progress for our village. A subscription paper is going the rounds, and a sufficient amount has been raised to secure the Chelmsford Band for the day. This is deservedly a favorite with our residents, and its members will give concerts at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. There will also be a ball game morning and afternoon, and other sports are being arranged for. If the funds are sufficient, there will be fireworks in the evening. Alfred W. Hartford and J. Herbert Fletcher are at the back of this commendable enterprise, and they bespeak the helpful cooperation of all the townspeople in making the observance a real success. Dr. Orion Wells' parents, their names were Lucian and Catherine Wells, whose home is in southern Vermont, are visiting at their son's home. I think they lived in Bakersfield, Vermont, which would be in northern Vermont, not southern Vermont. A little daughter has recently been born to Mr. and Mrs. Albert Staples Hall at their home in Malden. This is of interest to many of our readers from the fact that Mrs. Hall was formerly Miss Edith Babbitt, one of the popular teachers at the Academy. The Honorable Thomas J. Boynton, a prominent lawyer of Boston, is to give the address at the Academy graduation on Friday morning, June 30th, at the Town Hall. The big power sprayer purchased by the town sometime since was at work early in the week on the shade trees in the center. It was an interesting sight to see the gang of workmen handle some of the tall trees on Main Street. I believe this is an insecticide sprayer that sprayed for gypsy moths and brown-tailed moths whose caterpillars would eat the leaves off the trees in town. The gardener at Abiel J. Abbott's, M.J. Maloney, comes in a close second with our well-known resident at the Old Open Bucket, that is Samuel L. Taylor, in the first picking of peas. He gathered a good quantity Monday, June 12th, from seed planted April 13th. Since then, reports of other early pickings have come in. The plentiful rains of this week have been a boon to the farmers. The midweek prayer services of the Congregational Church were held this week at the schoolhouse in Parkerville. Mr. and Mrs. Bertram Adams of Barton, Vermont, were guests at Mr. and Mrs. Alfred W. Hartford's Monday and Tuesday. Mrs. Adams and Mrs. Hartford are cousins, and Mrs. Adams with her husband were on their wedding trip, having been to New York and other places of interest. Representatives from the Lowell Electric Light Corporation and our selectmen have recently planned the locations for the poles for the electric lights in the 4 villages, who will be enjoying the benefits of electric lights before long. Mr. and Mrs. J. Willard Fletcher attended the 25th wedding anniversary of Mr. and Mrs. George Fletcher at their home in Fitchburg, Tuesday of this week. There were a good number present, and it was a most enjoyable affair. Some beautiful articles of silverware were presented to Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher. The 4 Fletcher brothers were all present for the occasion. Miss Marjorie Seavey is visiting at the home of Mrs. E.J. Meacham in Holyoke. Mrs. Meacham is remembered as Miss Millie Smith, who taught at the Old Center Primary School. Mrs. Elizabeth Hamlin, Miss Evelyn Hamlin, Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher, and Miss Hazel Hartford attended the commencement exercises at Miss Kimball's Home School for Girls at Worcester this last week, from which Mrs. Gertrude Hamlin, who was about 18 years old, was graduated. At the Congregational Church last Sunday morning, Mr. Wallace's sermon was addressed to the young people, particularly to those who were students. He gave a most excellent address of interest to old and young, elucidating particularly the subtopics of character, health, education, vocation, and social service. Next, we have the About Town section. The selectmen are making arrangements with the Lowell Electric Light Company in regard to the proper location of poles for wiring the villages for electric lighting of the streets. This was mentioned under the Westford Center section also. In addition, the Westford Water Company are to have installed a reserve power by the Lowell Company for use at the pumping station for emergency. Hamilton Edson Whitney and Miss Lena Maud McCormick of Littleton were married last week, Wednesday evening, that would be June 7th, 1911, at the Whitney Homestead on the Carlisle Road by Reverend Benjamin Bailey. He was the pastor of the Unitarian Church for First Parish Church on the Common in Westford. In the account of the WCTU, the Women's Christians Temperance Union, meeting last week, special mention was unintentionally omitted of the grandly inspiring paper by Mrs. Homer M. Seavey on, quote, how to bring up children, end quote, and properly arranged in the varied exercises came the stirring solos by Mrs. Cyril A. Blaney and Mrs. Charles D. Colburn. I believe they were both sopranos. Mrs. Eliza J. Perham, whose death was mentioned last week, will be remembered by the older residents as the daughter of William Chandler, one of the old residents of Westford, whose name and history appears so frequently in the history of Westford. His home and farm, nestling on the southern slope of Flushing Hill, and the dooryard lawn is sprayed by the waves of Flushing Pond. This house is still there at what is now 18 Tingsboro Road on the big bend that you go around Flushing Pond. Mrs. Perham was the widow of Alfred Perham, and her married life was spent in Tingsboro. Last week, while camping at the Edwards camps at Nabnasset Pond, one of Fred Edwards' children fell on an axe, lacerating one cheek from the eye downwards toward the feet. Dr. Wells was called and administered ether, and several stitches were taken. Walter Steele played the violin accompaniment at the children's Sunday school concert at the village church at West Chelmsford last Sunday evening. The alumni of Westford Academy will give their annual dance and reception on Friday evening, June 30th. Music by Hibbard's Orchestra of Lowell, the leader of which is serving his fourth term in the Massachusetts Senate. The committee, on the part of the alumni to stir up arrangements and a contagious faith and zeal of the long, with a capital L, days are Charles L. Hildreth and William R. Taylor. The long in long days mentioned here refers to former Academy preceptor John Davis Long, who later became the governor of Massachusetts and then Secretary of the Navy. The old First Parish Church will hold its annual meeting for election of officers and hear the reports of officers and committees on Monday evening, June 19th at 8 o'clock in the church parlors. The clerk of the parish, Abiel J. Abbott, has been absent in Washington, looking after the tariff reciprocity program in its relation to the Abbott-Worston Company. Amos Poley has just finished mowing machine eating of spring wheat and has finished second hoeing. With the aid of one man, he averages to hoe 3 acres a day. Popcorn, yellow corn, sweet corn, potatoes, and milk, with a few scattering attempts of home gardening, are the specialties of Prairie Farm. That's the farm of Amos Poley, who was a neighbor of Samuel L. Taylor, the writer of this section. So named because neither wall, tree, or hill is in his way when he goes out to till. The busy, thriving, driving Grieg Farm on Main Street are busy, thriving and driving the strawberry harvest, which promises to return thanks for the recent spraying by the clouds. This was the old Hicks home across Main Street from Fairview Cemetery, then known as the Grieg Farm. The garden of Abiel J. Abbott was first early on record with sweet peas in blossom on June 5th. This seems remarkably early compared with some who have not yet planted their sweet peas, but those were nice sweet peas the old Oaken Bucket farm had for dinner last Saturday. The Spring Conference of Unitarian and other Christian churches will be held at Ashby, Wednesday, June 21st. At 10:30, an address will be given by Reverend John Bartleby of Hudson. Subject, quote, "How to Strengthen Our Churches Through the Conduct of Public Worship," end quote. At 11:10, Miss Harriet E. Johnson of the Arlington Street Church, Boston, will speak on, quote, "What to Teach in the Sunday School," end quote. At 2 p.m., an address will be given by Reverend Augustus P. Record of Springfield on, quote, "Institutional Loyalty," end quote. Automobiles and barge teams will meet at the 940 steam cars at West Townsend. Pilgrim and Commandery of Knights Templars of Lowell have accepted the invitation of Brethren of Bath, Maine, to a pleasure outing at Bath on Friday and Saturday, June 23rd and 24th. The Salem Cadet Band will accompany them. Among those planning to go from Westford are Walter C. Wright, Harwood Wright, William Woods, and William Taylor. The next paragraph is titled Birthday Anniversary. In the very room where she was born, Aunt Sarah Richardson observed her 93rd birthday on Wednesday, June 14th. She has outlived nearly all her old associates and neighbors, and new, and to her unknown personalities have taken their places. Consequently, the number of birthday visitors has been gradually lessening, but many timely remembrances of her long continued life were presented her by friends of varied degrees of acquaintance. Miss Richardson was the youngest of 8 children of Samuel and Amy Fletcher Richardson. Her early and only home has been at the Levi T. Fletcher Farm on the Lowell Road at Brookside. The address is 120 Lowell Road, and that house is still there. Only one person in town is older, Mrs. James Hildreth at the headwaters of Long Sought Pond, 93 years and 6 months. Next, we have the Forge Village section. Cameron School closed last Friday afternoon for the annual summer vacation. Mrs. Michael Keefe of Townsend spent Saturday and Sunday at the home of Mr. and Mrs. John Carmichael. The many friends of Mrs. A. Carkin will be pained to hear of her accident received while out driving. She is much better, however, and well on the way to recovery. There are several A. Carkins who lived in Westford about this time. I'm not sure which one that was. Miss Hattie Reed, formerly of this village, was married on Saturday, June 10, 1911, to Charles Kidder of Graniteville. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Lewis F. Havermale of the Graniteville Methodist Episcopal Church. The Mrs. Sarah and Maria May, aged about 19 and 17, left on Saturday for New York City, where they are to visit their sister, Mrs. Donald Holt, her maiden name being Cecilia May. Mr. Patrick May, their father, accompanied them part of the way on their journey. The Girls Friendly Society met in Recreation Hall of St. Andrew's Mission on Wednesday evening. The Ladies' Sewing Circle held their meeting at the home of Mrs. Harriet Randall on Wednesday afternoon. They were also of St. Andrew's Mission. Mrs. Elmer Nutting, née Mary E. Splain, is spending a few days with her sister, Mrs. Frank Rose, née Margaret Ellen Splain, of Belmont. She attended last Friday the graduation exercises of the Belmont High School, where her niece, Miss Marjorie Rose, was graduated. Mrs. John Spinner has been confined to her home the past few days by illness. Miss Elizabeth Plummer has returned from Salem, where she has been staying with her brother, who lies critically ill. Mr. and Mrs. Leclerc from Canada are visiting his brother, Felix Leclerc. John Bennett and wife of Worcester, together with Miss Ruth and John Bennett Jr., spent the weekend as guests of Alvin S. Bennett. The picnic of St. Andrew's Mission will be held at Sandy Pond on June 24th, together with St. Andrew's Church, Ayer. It is hoped that there will be a large crowd to make the picnic a grand success. Mr. and Mrs. William Precious and family spent Thursday in Lowell. Miss Edith Precious went to Townsend on Thursday to attend the graduation of the high school, where her niece, Miss Annie Keefe, was one of the graduates. The next section is titled Nearly Completed, referring to the work on the Catholic Church, St. Catherine's Catholic Church. Reverend E.T. Schofield of North Chelmsford announces that St. Catherine's Church would be ready for services very soon and that the parishioners would enter the new church free from debt, as all the expenses have been met. He further stated that Daniel Sullivan of Boston had presented the church with a set of vestments made of the cloth of gold and a gold chalice, all to be used in divine worship. A set of Stations of the Cross has been given by Mrs. Mary McDermott, and many memorial windows have been subscribed by the parishioners. He concluded, in the extending of the Abbott Worsted Company, his heartfelt thanks for their kindness and generosity in allowing him to hold services at Abbott Hall during the remodeling of the church. And from what I've read of the Abbott Worsted Company, I think it very likely that they also contributed funds toward the remodeling of the church. That's the news in Westford for the week ending June 17th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.